simplest version is it's carbon in the soil. It's in the name. In practice, what it is things that are living or recently were living, or things that have been processed after they were living. Nearly all carbon in the soil, with a tiny exception, is something that was currently or recently living. And if you're looking to manage that, then that's the easiest way to think about it, is how do I have more living things in the soil, and how do I prevent myself from losing that carbon when they pass away. So carbon comes out of the sky. It sounds silly, but that's what it is. It's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, picked up by plants during photosynthesis and turned into sugars. The sugars are carbon molecules. An animal eats the plant, part of the plant, and it poops something out, and that gets washed into the soil. That's got into the soil. Another is an insect that does that. Or the plant roots live and die in the soil, and that's carbon. But the biggest one by volume and by ability to change by management is root exudates. And what that means is plant makes sugars, and they use that for their own energy, which that's common knowledge, but they also put a percentage of that out through the roots tips into the soil. And so they put it out in the form of sugars. The purpose from their perspective is that they want to feed bacteria and fungi in the soil. They can't do their own photosynthesis. They need carbon/sugars for energy, same way we do. And the plant wants them to do jobs like fighting off disease or creating soil structure or bringing in nutrients and water to the plant, and it pays them in plant sugars. So if you're looking to optimize that, then you're looking for as many root tips as possible, as much coverage of the soil as possible with green living leaves that are doing photosynthesis, and that there's nothing in the soil that is preventing the growth in population of soil microbes. There's lots of different types, and there's lots of very strong opinions about what the right ways are to do it. So some of the accepted ones are making sure you've got 100% ground cover at all times. Step up from that is 100% green cover at all times, or as many times as possible. As much of the year as possible. Those things both prevent the loss of carbon and increase what's in there. On top of keeping 100% ground cover, grazing management is something that's very popular at the moment and has quite good evidence. It seems like it's not 100%, but it's quite good in that if you use a high stocking density for a short time, like it maybe only be 1 day, and that means the animals eat everything and they trample anything that they don't, and they poop all over everything, and then they move on, and the plant's got a really long time to recover. That replicates what happens in grasslands with huge grazing herds. And there's a lot of theories and a lot of practice showing that that can significantly increase the amount of sugars that the plant puts in the ground, and also the vigor of its growth, which can mean more photosynthesis. There's another way on top of that, which is coming to light now, and that's a lot of what we do, is stimulating soil biology to increase their population and diversity, and increasing the branching of plant roots. So if plants are taking carbon dioxide out of the air and turning it into sugars, and they're putting some of that into the soil as root exudates to feed microbes, they're doing that through the very tip of the root. And if you've got one there and it's got a certain amount of capacity to go that if you have, I should have had 2 pens ready. If you've got 2 tips, now you've got 2 places for carbon to come out. So every time you go from one root tip to having a branch in your root and now having 2 root tips, you've potentially doubled the amount of carbon that can be pumped into the soil. And so, yeah, you have more detail on another answer. None of what I say at the moment is a criticism of how things are done. It's criticism of you, listener, as an individual, that you're not being a good farmer. It's none of that. A lot of these things, it's an accidental side effect of what has been given to people as best practice for a long time. It's just that there's side effects, and it doesn't mean you can't use them. It means that you need to be aware of what might happen as a result. And so one that is quite well known now is excess cultivation. If you're ploughing 3 or 4 times a season, you're getting rid of the green things that are putting carbon into the soil. You're killing a lot of the bacteria and fungi, which are on major storages and the processor of carbon in the soil. And you're exposing carbon that's already there to oxidization with the general atmosphere, which means that it can be lost back into the atmosphere. And so, as well as breaking up things like fungal hyphae networks, which transport carbon around the soil and make forms of carbon that are really stable, those things all come together, so you lose carbon. Doing a little bit of cultivation once every few years can be a really good thing. Doing it every year, and even more, doing it multiple times a year, is going to lose carbon. Sometimes it's going to be a good reason to do it. It's just that it'll be at the expense of soil carbon. And so another more controversial one is the use of herbicides and pesticides. But they have been an absolute game changer for agriculture and being able to scale up with limited labor and make bigger farms that are more cost effective, and have made farmers able to still be profitable in the face of reduced income per ton of output in real terms, increased costs and low labor. And so they've been an incredible innovation in that way, but pretty much all of them, it's probably not all of them, but all the ones that I know of, suppress soil biology for some period of time. So even if it's one day, for one thing, you've lost 1 day's worth of them processing sugars into forms that are more stable and stick around, helping you build soil carbon. The other part of it is that you are likely, if you actually kill particularly the bacteria, they're going to break down very rapidly, and they're going to be eaten by other weedy species of bacteria who are going to breathe that carbon out as carbon dioxide, and you lose it from the soil. And so you've both lost opportunity for building carbon, and you've lost carbon that was already in the soil. And I'm saying these things, but what I'm not saying is don't you ever dare do it, or you're an environmental vandal. What I'm saying is that it's a bit of information to add into your management. And if you have a particular weed that you would normally just spray, maybe you sit back and think, what's the dollar impact going to be if I don't spray this, or the practical impact? And whatever that value is, how much carbon am I potentially losing, and what's the relative value of the two? Which thing is going to be the better option for me? I would suggest that quite often, not always, quite often, prioritizing the carbon is going to be the right thing to do with or without soil carbon projects. But there's absolutely plenty of situations where I would recommend using the herbicide or pesticide. The other, even more controversial one, again, this isn't criticism, this is an outcome of a particular community circumstance of scientists and food producers and people who buy food, nitrogen. So nitrogen is essential for growth. Nitrogen is essential for organic carbon to be in the soil. Where the problem lies in is in excess nitrogen for that soil. It's not a particular number. It's for that soil on that day. What can it handle without getting out of balance? And so when you have excess nitrogen, and the way that we know that is the carbon to nitrogen balance. Soils are ideally at about 11 units of carbon to 1 unit of nitrogen. And soils all over the world, if they're left to their own devices, will settle out of this level. The total might be up here and the total might be down here, but the ratio will stay the same after it's been allowed to settle from any disturbance of any kind. So microbes are normally limited by the total amount of nitrogen, as in their total populations are limited by the amount of nitrogen. They'll grow to the point where they run out of easily accessible nitrogen to build new microbial bodies, and then they'll settle out around there and it'll go up and down a bit. That's sort of the maximum. They usually hit that as their limitation first. So if you've got 11 to 1 carbon to nitrogen and you bump up the nitrogen, now there's a heap of available nitrogen. So going back to this, that level there is about what you get in microbial bodies, 11 to 1. So they've hit that maximum. When you add in more nitrogen, now this ratio is different. And now there's some extra nitrogen in there that is now available to go into new microbial bodies. And so microbe populations will take off and they'll use up all of the available plant exudates, the sugars that they put in the soil. And that's just a thing. That's not necessarily good or bad. But when they run out of those, and if there's still readily available nitrogen, they'll start to attack the longer lasting forms of carbon. So the humus, which is huge carbon molecules, there's the glomalin produced by mycorrhizal fungi, other things that are smaller forms of complex carbon. Normally they're not worth attacking because the amount of energy you have to expend to get energy back from a carbon atom, it's normally not worth it. It's too much work to get in there. But when there's the resource available where they can increase their populations drastically, a lot of microbes will move to attacking these. And as soon as they do that, you're at risk of a net loss of carbon because those are very stable forms of carbon that are sticking around. If you break them down, now they're within a microbial body, they're going to breathe out some of that as they're using energy. And then if something goes wrong in the near future, they will die off and you'll lose the carbon then as well. And so using nitrogen of any form, doesn't matter if it's organic or chemical, whatever, in a way that significantly disrupts the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the soil, whatever that soil is, opens up the possibility of losing soil carbon through that method. And it is probably one of the primary methods that most agricultural soils in Australia and other similar relatively lower rainfall places around the world, that soil carbon has been lost. So it's still entirely possible to use nitrogen fertilizers of any form. It's just another thing we need to add in the thought, what's it going to do to my soil carbon? How do I balance the two competing priorities? And just the tiny little addendum to that is that a big chunk of nitrogen that gets put on in chemical forms gets lost as a gas. So if you can do things that reduce that loss, you can put a lot less nitrogen on, which is great for your pocket regardless, but also won't disrupt the carbon to nitrogen balance in the soil as much, and tends to lead to conditions that further reduce the loss of nitrogen, which we can further reduce it and you're more profitable and you all those other really good conditions. There's no way that you need to sacrifice the use of nitrogen, sacrifice your income, sacrifice your profitability. It's the other way around. There's an opportunity to significantly reduce your costs. It's different for everyone, but reduce your costs and in the process create a soil that's a lot more efficient, a lot more resilient to all sorts of conditions. So it's an opportunity rather than a criticism or something that has to shut food production down. You don't have bad soil. You might have a soil that's struggling, that's not happy, that is crying out for help. There's a much higher chance of that. You don't have a bad soil. You do have a soil that has physical limitations at a certain level. Like there's an absolute maximum carbon capacity, there's an absolute maximum water holding capacity, nutrient capacity. Those are probably all higher than you think they are. But what is most common if you're sitting there thinking you've got a bad soil and asking John, do I have a bad soil? Is that there are things that are suppressing what it wants to do right now. And it doesn't have a mind, but it does seem to have a certain amount of decision-making capability that comes out of different organisms working in the soil responding to different conditions. And so if it's high water and low carbon, a certain set of things will happen. If it's the other way around, it's high carbon and low water. If it's high nitrogen, high carbon, like all these different sets of combinations will lead to outcomes that looks like a decision-making process. When you have a soil that's struggling, the thing to look for isn't a single measurement and then a direct response to that. For example, pH. I've got low pH, therefore that is the problem. That's what's causing my issue, whatever it is, which might be short root development, it might be lack of nutrition, availability, it could be various things. That isn't your problem, that is an outcome. And so it's probably something a few steps back that is leading to that set of conditions. And so this is what makes it hard, because soil is a biological system. It's got chemistry, it's got geology and biology all interacting. In a healthy functioning soil, there could be 5 billion bacteria in a bit of soil this big, the same size as this and USB cap, which was the closest thing I could see on my desk right now. And more different species in there than there are plant and animal species in the entire Amazon rainforest before we started messing with it. So the idea that we could properly understand that and all the different potential interactions in there is not really viable. We can't understand every single bit. We can step back and look at where things go up and down. So that means that if we've got pH being an indicator that's come up over here, that could have been something that happened over here that affected something over here that affected something over here that was back here, back here, back here, that ended up showing up this symptom here. So if we, well, let's say that's a button and we push it down to fix it, now what's happened to all these things over here, that could have not fixed the original problem over here and might have set up a chain of reaction, all those other things over here. So you're not expected to, because I've been studying it for 17 years and I don't necessarily know exactly what to do, but it is a really good idea to step back and look at the whole thing and go, is this system functional? What might stop it from being functional? And usually that's a combination of a lack of carbon and a lack of living things in the soil. I like to concentrate on bacteria and fungi and archaea, but also insects and worms and digging animals and all sorts of stuff. Why aren't they all there? So usually, in my recent experience, and I've been trained in all sorts of things and looking at the chemistry and looking at the physical aspects and looking at what species you're using and what type of tractor and grazing methods and all that sort of stuff, way more often I find that the actual fundamental issue is that something is suppressing root growth and soil biology. Because nearly every positive aspect of the soil, including the building and use of soil carbon, comes from roots and microbes. So sometimes it's as simple as too much phosphorus available in the soil. That will cause plants to choose, I'm using that choose word again, but there it is, to not make an association with mycorrhizal fungi. So they use mycorrhizal fungi to go out into the soil. And if a plant root is the size of my arm there, a plant hyphae is like what that looks like there, but times 100. They're way smaller. They can go way incredibly ridiculous lengths. You can get 20,000 kilometers of mycorrhizal hyphae in a square meter of soil, which I thought was not, it's bullshit. That's what I thought it was. I was trying to avoid that word. I couldn't get around it. But I went and did the calculations, and it's actually true. It's not, it can go a lot higher than that, is in the possibilities. Anyway, they make an association with the plant root. They get paid in sugar, and they bring back water that they explore from all these areas and are really strong at sucking. They also bring back phosphorus and other nutrients, but phosphorus, they have adaptions for mobilizing phosphorus. It's been really tightly locked up that plants can't get. And so if the plant's got plenty of phosphorus and enough water, it goes, don't need you, see ya. Which then means it's not growing its roots as much. It's not giving as much carbon into the soil. It's missing out on glomalin formation, which is probably one of the most stable forms of carbon in the soil. You're losing out on the other jobs that they do, including controlling nematodes, things like that. It's all these cascading issues come out of just a bit too much phosphorus. And you need phosphorus. And there's lots of places that absolutely need phosphorus fertilizer. If you're exporting, at some stage, you've got to replace it. But just like with nitrogen, it's really easy to get a bit too far in one direction and disrupt a whole system. So if I've come along and looked at that sort of soil, usually you try and find that sort of reason, but do something to stimulate the soil biology, which is why we make Carbon Boost, because we went right back to the start of how things work and tried to come up with a tool that would help with these situations. Carbon Boost stimulates the soil biology, whether the conditions are good or bad, and stimulates a lot of extra root growth and branching and more exudates per root tip. And then those things tends to leading to most problems being at least reduced and at least giving you the capacity to start to grow more things and have some time to change some methods and observe what's happening and be able to get on top of the things that were making your soil bad. This has been a long explanation. Lots of things I've left out, but it's one of the things that makes it so hard to manage and particularly recover soils is that you as a farmer or other land manager has got all these competing things that are nothing to do with understanding soil that are already very complex. And now here's this other thing you have to understand. So it's completely ununderstandable. Devoted the second half of my life to it. And that's where we get the answer. Go back to the start is you don't have a bad soil. If things aren't going well, you have a soil that is being prevented from doing what it wants to do, which is be productive and functional. And there'll be something out there or a combined set of things that are leading to that in a non-obvious way. And you can either just use some sort of stimulant like Carbon Boost to help you get through the process or ask someone like me for help. Every soil is different, so not necessarily such a thing as a good reading. Soil biology, it's got a few factors. If you think if you're asking that question, you're most likely going to be asking about in terms of what they're doing in the soil. And so you can have, exaggeration, but you can have 2 bacteria that are really lazy, and you can have 2 bacteria. I've got weird stuff on my desk. 2 bacteria that are incredibly hard workers. So there can be the same biomass between the 2, the same total weight of microbes in your soil, which is what you usually measure. But these ones are working hard and these ones aren't, and you get 2 very different outcomes. So one of the easiest and quickest and cheapest ways to actually put a number on these things is to use something like a microbiometer, which is a readily available tool. It costs about $300. Use it with your smartphone, and for about $10 a sample, you can measure the total microbial biomass in the soil per liter or cubic centimeter, and it'll tell you the balance between bacteria and fungi. That's something that's pretty easy to get caught up on, the balance between the 2. But generally, if you've got lots and lots of bacteria and only a few fungi, things might be out of whack. It could be a temporary thing. If you've got heaps and heaps of fungi and no bacteria, it's probably not very productive soil. Like it'll hold water and do stuff like that, but it won't actually grow much. You're looking for somewhere in the middle. 50-50 I think is good. There's all sorts of different opinions, and even in soils that I know are functioning amazingly, if I test them day to day, they can change a lot. And if I'd read it this day, I'd tell one story. If I read it the other day, I'd tell another story. If I put all the days together, I'd tell another story again. So you can measure the biomass and the breakdown like that. You can do more complicated tests where you send it off to a lab and they come back with how many species there are and a bit of a breakdown of what some of those are. That's really interesting. If you're a very experienced microbiologist, that can tell you something interesting, but it's really easy as a soil manager to get caught up on saying, okay, I've got too many actinomycetes or something like that, and start to manage those. But that measurement on that day could have just been because conditions were perfect on this day, and the populations can go up and down and double in a day easily, double or half. And so you're seeing a story of that day, and it is useful to get a total measure of diversity. If you've got lots and lots and lots and lots of species and you used to have not very many at all, then that is a great result no matter what the species is. I tend to lean away from looking at individual species and looking at the overall amounts. And the diversity is more important than what in each individual species, because you can have well, here's a number, 500 micrograms of carbon per milliliter of soil, or gram of soil, you put it either way. That is a moderate measurement, depending on where you are. In the desert, that's a huge result. In a tropical, not tropical area, but a subtropical, highly productive grassland, that's a tiny amount. But regardless, you could have 500 micrograms of one species that all it's doing is chewing out carbon, and that's a terrible result. Or you could have 500 micrograms of an incredibly diverse soil biology with thousands and thousands of different species that is doing all sorts of wonderful things for the soil, but this total amount of biomass was the same on that day. Very different outcomes. It's one of those things that becomes hard because we don't have a overall really quick fix, simple answer, or measurement rather. There's all these things that come together and they can vary day to day. Even when the tool is incredibly accurate, things vary so much it's hard to tell a story. But there's something even better that's had millions of years of development in it, and it makes me sound like I'm a weird hippie, but not there's anything wrong with hippies. Using your nose. Your nose is a incredibly cheap, incredibly effective way of measuring the activity on a certain day and over time. It doesn't cost you anything extra to dig a hole and sniff the soil every day. I'm not saying you need to do that, but if you wanted to learn, that's one way of doing it. your nose and your instincts together. This is hard science. This is an incredibly sensitive and complicated tool that we cannot replicate with machines. We can make some machines that for individual compounds are more sensitive, but we cannot make a machine that can be as sensitive across so many things at the same time, and do so many different compounds, thousands and thousands and thousands of different compounds we can smell. When microbes do activity, when microbes do things in the soil, they're doing carbon chemistry, and that creates aromatic compounds. Aromatic is a structural definition, but it's also things that we can smell. The more activity that's happening in the soil, the more smell will be produced. The more diversity of activity in the soil, the more complex the smell. So you don't need to be able to pick apart the things, but we instinctively know that you can have someone who's never ever dug a hole in their life, has never even thought about soil. You take them out of their inner city apartment and blindfold them and drag them to a farm and dig a hole, make them sniff, kicking and screaming, a bad soil and a good soil. And by bad soil and good soil, I mean a soil with pretty much no microbial activity and a soil with high and diverse microbial activity, and they will point to the good one every single time, because it's something built into us unless you actually have no sense of smell at all. And even then, looking at it, we still know. It blows my mind over and over and over how you can dig a hole and show it to someone and go, oh, that's good, no matter where they come from. Same with compost. So the best tool that we have, and probably the most accurate once you've had a bit of a play with it, is digging a hole in the soil, holding a bit up of the topsoil up to your nose and having a sniff. That'll tell you as reliably as any test that I know of, no matter how expensive the machine, and it'll cost you nothing extra than what you're already going to spend every day just to have the farm. Yeah, and you can do it all day, every day, and you will be right on that day. If you're using a microbiometer, good and bad readings, it can only measure down to about 200 and 250 micrograms per thing. So if you get less than that, it won't show up. Getting 1,000 is an amazing result. I haven't seen anything above 2,000 in person yet, but they're probably out there. Normally, I'm pretty happy if it's over 500 and it's not dominated by one species, by one group, bacteria or fungi. If it's somewhere within about 60-40, then either way, then that is going to be amazing. It's incredibly exciting because we're at a point where we're starting to understand the true fundamentals of how and why soils do what they do. And if we're able to not mess that up by pretending we know everything, soils are showing this absolutely incredible capacity to increase what they do. And that includes holding water and accepting water. That includes the amount of microbes that can be in there doing various jobs for us, which include things like eating methane, taking methane out of the atmosphere as cows emit it, completely cancelling that out. That happens in some circumstances. And all sorts of things, including our quality of life, just for being around soil in your yard. When those things go right, people feel good. When those things go right, we produce more food of higher quality for less resources than we ever have before, not through forcing things to happen, which is, we haven't termed it that way, but that's sort of what we've done. We've found a lever and we've pulled on it harder and harder and harder. Like pulled on the nitrogen lever, pulled on the phosphorus lever, pulled on the cultivation lever. Whatever tool we had in front of us, we just found ways to pull harder and harder and harder. Now we're finding ways that we can remove limitations more and more and more, as in helping the soil do what it wants to do, which is be diverse and productive, by taking away adverse conditions as much as they can. Soils, to me, represent the opportunity to fix the majority of environmental and between countries social problems that we face at the moment. I'm going right off into the ether, but I think I can support this pretty well. Wars increase where resources are limited. And so you can apply that to not really money, but things that are worth money like oil, and other types of resources. But water and food are the absolute fundamentals of civilization. If you don't have ready access to those, we all each individually come to the point that we will start to fight for our right to stay alive. Some people choose to lay down and die, but if there is a country that doesn't have enough water to drink, doesn't have enough food to eat, but still has some ability to be healthy and do something about it, then they going to attack another country to get the resources. They might try other things first, but if they're at crisis point, that's what they will do. And they know what their original way of doing things are. When it comes to the point of starvation, people do different things. And huge amount, not all, but a huge amount of the world's conflicts are because of some form of resource limitation, and the conflict comes about as a result of that resource limitation. The ultimate resource being water and food, and air, I suppose. But at least that's one thing that is very hard to go and get from somewhere else and bring back. So we have some problems at the moment. One is lack of fresh water globally, that we're not using those things well. Another is more specifically drought. And another is climate change. I come up with heaps of these, but is an excess of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and related compounds like methane that are contributing to trapping more of the sun and the earth's heat in the atmosphere, which is creating a temperature rise and is having certain outcomes. Some places are doing better because of it, others are doing much worse. Overall, we're getting much less predictability, and we don't know where we're going to be, which is a huge risk to the way we produce food right now if we don't change things. Just on the carbon part, the carbon in agricultural soils in broadacre stuff and not in the highest producing regions tends to be between 1% and 2% across the world, whereas the actual carrying capacity of soils is about 10%. They do vary, like 10% of a clay is more carbon than 10% of a sand, but they can all be that percentage. So if you calculate how many hectares of agricultural land there are that are being managed in this sort of way that can be modified, if you go to 1 meter soil depth and you calculate how much extra carbon could be stored there, you can take out all of the carbon that we've emitted already. And in the process, create this incredibly resilient food production system. So I'm incredibly excited about the future because we've personally seen results where we've had a 1% increase, as in going from 1% to 2% soil carbon in under 12 months. That doesn't happen all the time. It's not something we can promise all the time, but with a combination of using our products and not even big management changes, but just changes in prioritization, that these things can happen really quickly, way quicker than we think. So we're a fairly small company still. We've produced 1 million litres of carbon boost so far. And if you take the results that we've got and you scale them up, we have helped put between 10 and 15 million tons of carbon dioxide in the soil, which is more than BHP or RE or anyone has done with trying to do geosequestration, pumping carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil, back deep down into the rock. And we've done it for bugger all money. It's just the fact that that possibility is there can completely reverse climate change, especially when you add in water. Changes in the way that water behaves through changes in soil management is at least as big as what carbon dioxide has done. So if we reduce the level of carbon dioxide to whatever point we decide is the right one, definitely don't want to go too far, and if we change the way that the water system works, particularly on a local level, that changes the way that rainfall happens. It changes the patterns of rainfall. It becomes smaller amounts more often. It changes the way that soils accept water. It changes the way that things can grow. It drastically, like 100 times, increases the stability of food production. And storing water in soil for longer leads to a trickle going out into creeks that flow all the time, instead of a creek that floods and goes dry, or a river, or whatever you want to call it, wherever you are. So if we're changing the rainfall pattern to be less runoff, we're changing the soil to accept more water faster. We've seen personally differences from going from 40 mil per hour to 2,400 mils per hour. So that means basically any storm gets taken up, unless it goes on for so long the soil's saturated, increasing the water holding capacity by up to 10 times. So we've got more friendly rainfall, more ability to take up the water that does fall, more ability to store and give back to plants the water that's got available, a carbon dioxide level in the air that is not causing problems anymore, and an incredibly resilient system that is contributing to manage the amount of water and carbon in the air. Now you've got this system that produces as much food as we like, gives us the ability to all be fed and comfortable, albeit something goes wrong in a local area, but that everyone has that capability. We can genuinely do it forever, and we can start to include other species with us. We can make space for biodiversity without limiting our ability to produce food. There's just all these things that come from changing a few key things and changing a few key things in here. Not drastic. You don't have to change your lifestyle at all, really. You don't have a better lifestyle, but can fix everything. So I'm incredibly, incredibly excited about where agriculture can take everyone and everything in the world and do it within a lifetime. It's entirely possible. I'm 45. I live to 90. If these ways of thinking take off, which they are gradually doing, I could see a huge change within my lifetime, which is exciting. So farming doesn't get enough credit. And I'm sitting here saying all these other answers that in some ways criticize farming development and farming innovations. I definitely think there's things that we had unintended side effects. But those things aside, like, there's probably, if you take the average view of most people who aren't involved in farming, and they would never want to say this out loud, but they'd probably think that farmers farm because they're not smart enough to be a lawyer. That is often true in the sense of a lot of the people who farm don't like being inside for long enough to study to become a lawyer, but it doesn't mean they're not smart enough to be that. And I would contend that farmers have one of the most difficult jobs. in managing a business. If we're going to manage a business, there's plenty of people who just buy a pen and sell a pen for 20 cents more, who complain about how hard it is. Whereas farmers manage this incredibly complex soil and plant system whilst being subject to global price changes, by being subject to the whim of the general populace, which could make things all of a sudden they can't do anymore, like using. I'm not going to argue about whether that's right or not, but that's something that could change purely through public opinion changing. You can have legislation changes. You can have drastically different amounts of the resources that you need to make your money and output, like water, drastically change in the course of a year. I can't think of another business that has so many interlocking factors that all vary so much. And to be a farmer that even just keeps afloat, it's incredibly hard. So I'd say that if you're looking for someone to do a job that doesn't necessarily require you to do 6 years of study to be a doctor or a lawyer, then they're some of the most capable people you'll ever come across. I do that myself. I come out of farming. I was a farmer, but I hire farmers as much as I can to do work for me, because I know when the truck breaks down that they're driving, they'll fix it themselves, or they'll zip tie it together somehow in a way that gets it home. There's things that are listed like the stump truck plow, or invention of chemicals, or all sorts of things like that. Like the Green Revolution has had there's some huge negative downsides of the Green Revolution, but also the work of Norman Borlaug has been my hero for a long time. I've now learned a lot about what the downsides are of that, but all these incredible innovations. But my favorite innovations are nearly always something that a farmer made in their shed or the paddock because they had to. And they're the things that blow my mind. Like the invention of nitrogen fertilizer, like that came from, that's been, for better or worse, an absolute game changer. There's some people who say that half of the people who are alive today are alive because of nitrogen fertilizer, that they would not be that part of a population that large without it. And whatever criticisms you might have of how it's been used, it's pretty hard to say to half of humanity, you don't deserve to be alive. And I'm not going to say that. It came through chemistry. It came through someone who was trying to invent something else. And they did progressive little steps of improvement of something that I think is relatively simple. Like it looks big and complex, but it's taking this molecule that's got 2 nitrogens, putting extra energy in to split them apart and giving it other stuff to join onto, which is good as a plant fertilizer. That's it. That's building nitrogen fertilizer. It looks big and impressive. It was split these 2 things up because you can't use them like that and give it something else. That's it. Whereas some of the things that I've seen farmers invent are way more complex, but they never get the credit. Like people designing new types of machinery or new components for machinery, which require an intuitive understanding of physics, the way that the chemistry of metal works, the way that soils react to different types of pressure, whether it's a broad push or a narrow point or all these different things. Just inventing a new type of tine for an agricultural implement and doing it in your shed is incredibly, incredibly impressive, especially for someone who's got to be managing all this other stuff. So the combined thing of what's my favorite innovation and in agriculture and what is what makes farmers such incredible innovators is, my favorite is anything that someone's made in their shed or it's made on their farm somehow. And the fact that these people who are managing these incredibly variable situations, that they have very little influence on most of those variabilities and still feed the rest of us. That's what makes farmers just incredible, and people who should be lauded at the top of society, because farmers is what creates society. If we don't have excess food, that means everyone has to make their own food, and they don't have time for art, they don't have time for science, they don't have time for building police systems, they don't have time for all the things that make your life so the safest and the most amazing. For all the things you hear on the news, this is the safest time to ever be alive. And that all comes from specialists in producing food, giving you the time to do other things. That's what builds society beyond village scale. And that happens because of farmers. I started Carbon Rich because I'm really annoying. I ask questions that challenge people's deeply held beliefs and sacred cows. And I'm not doing it to be annoying. I'm doing it because there's this little voice inside me. It's not that little. A voice inside me that goes, that doesn't make sense. Like, you've just told me this story, and I don't think that adds up to the answer that or the outcome that you're showing me. And those outcomes that they're showing me and the story that they're telling me is often very closely linked to who that person I'm talking to believes that they are, which could be a good scientist or a good farmer or a good motor mechanic or all sorts of things. And I come along with my really annoying brain that looks at things at a bit different angle and connects things in a bit different way, not because I've worked hard at it, but because that's just how I'm wired. And ask questions. All I'm trying to do is understand better, and try and make it make sense, because it really, really hurts me when things don't make sense, or there's not a good reason for why they don't make sense. And so my whole life, I've been going around reinventing things. Some of those are just different ways to build with Lego. Some of those are that I drive my car in an idiosyncratic way that's not that different, but it's ever so slightly different because I've experimented and not believed some of the things I heard. And sometimes those things were right, and sometimes they weren't quite right, or they were right, but the explanation was wrong. And there was something else to be found there to make it a bit better. I can't help myself but optimize things. If I'm just shoveling in a yard, I try and find a better way to do it. If you leave me to my own devices, I'll redesign a shovel, and then I'll invent the first mechanized way of shoveling, and then I'll do this and that. And I just can't stop myself from doing these things. So I'm also driven by sustainability in the context of, can we produce food forever without having to kill everything else on the planet? Because I absolutely love being in nature, interacting with it, seeing how it works, watching it all function. It just feels right. It feels good in my soul. But also I love humans. And if nature was your top priority, get rid of humans. If humans are your top priority, get rid of nature. But I want to balance both. And I think that is one of the best situations, is balancing both. So I went looking for various things. I was trying to own my own sustainable farm, but financial circumstances meant that I couldn't. Eventually, I went to university. I wanted to be a professor, because I thought that might be the way to link my farming knowledge and experience and the science and try and make things develop faster. Turned out that wasn't the right place. And I fell into composting almost by accident. I stayed in it not by accident, because it was one of the most incredible things I could find on to work for overall sustainability of food production and making room for biodiversity within and around that food production. So worked with compost for 10 years, working for other people, set up 7 facilities around Australia, mine's the 8th, helping other people to start composting, teaching them how to do it, been involved in making well over 1 million tons of compost. In that time, made a huge amount of observations of things. So that doesn't make sense. In a huge amount of different environments, with a huge amount of different people. And there were these things that I knew were possible, but I couldn't convince other people to do it. So eventually I had to put my money where my mouth was, because not because of some ego thing, but because the pain of seeing these potential things that could happen and then not being in the world was something I couldn't handle. And so I went off and started Carbon Rich. We always knew we were going to make compost. There's all these other things that we want to do as part of our overarching company, Chart and Bang. But compost was the first thing. We always knew we were going to value add. And as part of what we did, part of what I'd learned, part of looking at the situations in agriculture, what were the things that needed to change and what were the most effective ways of doing it, compost was just right up there. But solid compost is really difficult sell for agriculture, for broadacre agriculture. The amount you need per hectare and the purchase price, particularly where it's a high enough quality, is a scary number. Like, it might pay off, but it's more than most types of farms can generate to make that investment without taking a huge risk. And then it's only produced in a few locations, which are normally hundreds of kilometers from any given farm. It's bulky, you need a lot of volume per hectare, so you pay a lot in trucking costs on top of the purchase price. Then you've got to have a special sort of spreader. You've got to have 2 tractors or one with a loader that you take on and off to fill it and out and out. It's another job, and it just ends up, even when you do a trial and you go, oh, this is amazing, it's not practical or financially viable in a lot of cases. And so I was looking at that going, okay, so I found compost, which is an amazing thing to help all these things that drive me. But it's not practical or economically viable. What are the fundamentals? It seems that the soluble organic molecules, carbon molecules and other things that come out of compost when you spread on the surface and it rains, that is the key fundamental driver of what compost does in agriculture. It's different when you work it in, it's different things there, and when you use really high rates, but what is the fundamental for broad agriculture? It was soluble carbon, soluble organic molecules. So it can take 4 years to get the full benefit out of a surface application of compost. And we went, why does it take that long? And the answer is that compost has 2 fundamental properties. One, it'll hold 3 times its weight in water if it's highly mature, the sort of compost that we make. And when it goes dry, it rejects water, becomes hydrophobic. So if you've got compost sitting on the surface of the soil and it starts raining, so it's got to rain long enough that this particle of compost has overcome its water repellency, which takes time. So you might need a 2-hour long rainfall event, or some rain and then more rain 2 hours later, and it hasn't dried out in between. Then once you've had enough rain, enough moisture to get it to start to accept water, then you have to have 3 times its weight in water getting into it, which is a lot of water. And then it starts to run through. So you've had to have this long rainfall event to open it up. You've had to have enough continuous rain, slow enough that it's being absorbed before you get anything out of it. So that's really inefficient. That's why it can take so long, because the events where all those conditions come together to push some of the soluble carbon into the soil are, particularly in inland Australia, relatively uncommon. So what's the fundamental thing there? It's you've got some compost, you run water through it and get the soluble stuff out. Maybe we can make that way more efficient. So we got to this point by ourselves, thinking through things from fundamental level. And then we went, oh, that's a compost extract. That idea already exists, but it wasn't being done commercially. That's different from compost tea. Compost tea extracts what's soluble, adds some nutrients like fish emulsion, adds some molasses for energy, and you're trying to breed up a heap of bacteria and fungi to go spread them on the paddock. We weren't doing that. We were trying to provide the carbon/organic molecules. So we didn't need to do that other stage. We just needed to get it through there as efficiently as possible. And by experimenting from starting by hand, we got to the point where, like, I had my hands in wet compost, doing things to try and get everything out of it. We learned the maximum amount that you can dissolve into water before you have to start to force it. And we learned what is the right pattern to get all of that out. These are some of the things that we did invent, and it's one of the few things we don't tell people. We'll tell you everything else about how to make the process, but not those specifics. And that ended up making 1 kilogram of compost is now 1,000 times more efficient per hectare. And so we're forgetting the soil health effects that we were looking for. We've gone from 3 to 5 tons of compost down to 30 litres of extract, which only contains a few hundred grams of compost. We get 90% of our compost ends up in that. We only get about 10% of the solids left over, and most of that's clay from the surface we operate on. That now bridged the gap between, okay, we've got soils with certain problems that cause challenges for food production. Compost is this amazing tool between it, but it's not practical or economic for large scale farming. Now we've addressed the reasons, so we addressed the reasons that lead to you wanting compost. To address those reasons, we made the next leap of what makes this hard, what can we fix there? And now we've got an option that can be 100 times less expensive per hectare. You can put it through any boom spray, any nozzle, any irrigation system, any plane, any sort of application system we've come across so far. We can put it through that. So there's no limitations there. It's at least 100 times cheaper per hectare and works better and faster. So we didn't create carbon rich in order to create carbon boost, but we did create carbon rich in order to be able to create solutions like that. And carbon boost, liquid compost extracts, is an outcome of our way of approaching problems, and there will be others to follow that. We're working on a nitrogen product and a phosphorus product, and will be various other things as well, as we have time and money to do so. But the reason we created Carbon Rich was to be able to follow that way of thinking, and Carbon Boost is one of the outcomes of that.